1 week season.
Hey, and welcome in, OWS fam. So glad you are with us. We are back in the DFS lab. As always, this show presented by 1 week season, where we build a lineup on DraftKings, use it as a way to talk through the upcoming slate. You thought you were through with us for doing these showdown ones on Monday, but thankfully we do still have one more showdown thanks to the scheduling for wildcards. And so myself and Xandamere are excited to walk through it with you guys. Of course, it is Monday morning, January 13th. We're coming to you recording this at 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. on the West Coast, where Xandamere is joining us from. And tonight we have the Vikings and the Rams in the final wild card game of the slate. And it's my privilege now to welcome up Xandamere. Xandamere, I'm so happy we get to do one more of these. I'm definitely maybe you could say chasing my losses a little bit. I didn't do great yesterday in the Sunday slate, but excited to play tonight for the Vikings and Rams. And check this out, man. I don't know how this happened. I have 3 kids, and I have one of them who's a huge football fan, just huge. I'm a Packers fan. Guess who his favorite team is? Vikings. The biggest rival, my most hated team growing up as a kid as a Packers fan. He's a Vikings fan. All that to say, I'll be rooting for the Vikings tonight for his sake. But how you doing, man? How was yesterday for you? Did you play any? Did you have any sweats? And just, I mean, it is crazy that we're just about done with the NFL season. But of course, you did have some action yesterday.
Yeah, I did. I did play yesterday. I had a lineup that needed a Baker Mayfield touchdown on that last drive for a shot at first place. Needed a passing touchdown, and they were at like the 12 or 13 yard line on second down and 1, and they failed to convert. They kicked a field goal to tie the game, and then the Commanders drove the field, kicked a field goal as time expired, and the game was over. So unfortunately, I had a chance. If he'd thrown the touchdown, I would have been in first place, though I would have then had to dodge Jaden Daniels coming back the other way. So it's not a guaranteed first place, but it would have been a good finish, no doubt. So.
And what contest was that in?
It was the big FanDuel GPP yesterday, the 650K Sunday special.
Okay, so it was just the Sunday games. It wasn't like Saturday or anything.
Yeah. So unfortunately, the big slate, like the 6-game slate, I think had a lot of really interesting strategy elements in it, and Hilo and I talked through that on the show on Saturday, the slate. But unfortunately, on FanDuel, at least, they didn't really. The 6-game contest size was really, really bad.
Same on DraftKings. Like, it was like the prize pools were minuscule. It was clear they were not pushing people towards those contests.
Yeah. Well, they want to turn the money over as fast as possible, right? Like the faster they cycle the money, you could enter more, right? So
it is true, man. And I mean, even as DFS players, like, I think that we kind of, to a certain extent, prefer that as well. Like, having money tied up for an entire 3-day slate can be a little like annoying, especially if you like blow the first 2 games and then you have to sit and watch the next 4 knowing that you're dead. But still, like, I think that the strategy elements, there were plenty of nice strategy elements. So yeah, man. But yeah, dude, I mean, we were just talking for a moment before, but I mean, you have had a lot of very close finishes this year, and that can be the hard thing about just the results side of DFS is that, like, staying patient through just what is, obviously a fairly small sample size when you look at the NFL, but still trying to, like, embrace the fact that you are having those sweats. You're in those top, your metrics are good in terms of top 1% finishes, but it can be hard to be patient when you really need things to break your way.
That's definitely true, right? And we said it on this show before. I've said it many places, and I'm far from the only person espousing this, right? But all we can do is try to put ourselves in position where we need that one last thing to break our way in order to win. That's all we can do as DFS players. And if we consistently do that, we should eventually have that last thing break our way and win. But that's the best we can do, right? It's the best thing we can do. And so it can be deeply frustrating when it doesn't break our way in a small sample. And like you said, even an NFL season is a small sample at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right. So one thing, like one key way to look at how you're doing is tracking what percentage of your lineups you place in what brackets in tournaments. So like what percentage of your lineups you place in the top 1% is a common one that people look at. if you place more than 1% of your lineups in the top 1% of tournaments, you're playing well, and you basically should just kind of sit back and keep doing what you're doing and wait for variance to swing your way. Probably want more than like 1.2% to account for a break. And then if you're playing really big tournaments, you can get a little more refined. Like I would actually say it's valuable to look at like say top 0.1%, even though that sounds like a very narrow slice, because top 1% in a 10,000 person tournament, like if you're a hundredth in a 10,000 person tournament, odds are you're probably not actually that close to first. Like you're probably 10 points at least out of first place, because the way the score is distributed at the high end, at the very high end. So it's not like you need that one last thing to break your way, one guy to get one more catch. You probably needed a few things for that lineup to break. But top 0.1% can be useful that as well. And so I placed the course of this season, I placed 3.3% of my lineups in the top 1% of tournaments, and then about something like 2 point something. I have to go look 2 point something in the top 0.1% of tournaments.
Wow.
And so that's actually the best season I've ever had since I started tracking those results that way, which was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And so from a process perspective, from a putting myself in a good position to succeed perspective, it was a great season. From an actually getting the last thing to get all the way to the top, it was unfortunately not a great season. So that's the way it goes, right? And that's why it's gambling. That's why it is a game of skill, right? But it's a game of skill with a high element of variance inherent to it.
And to that point, just to ask real fast, do you ever, like a season like this where you say this is the best I've had in terms of those metrics, will you look back and say, was there something that I did particularly well, or is it just over time you getting better, like as you play more and have more experience? Or will you look back and say, oh, like you pick out a couple things that like definitely continue to do these things going forward?
Yeah. So I think it's worthwhile to reflect. And self-reflection is something that is hard for humans. And this is sort of more of a life philosophy for me, this is more than just a DFS philosophy, right? This is like a life philosophy for me. That self-reflection is a very important skill in life. And it's hard because it means we have to be humble. There's a saying, and I'm going to mangle it because I'm just going to paraphrase it because I can't get the quote right. But it's basically, when things go well, we tend to think it's because of something we did right. When things go wrong, we tend to think it's bad luck. And that's not just DFS. But it's very true in DFS, right? But that tends to apply to many, many areas of life. But if that's really like, if we approach things from that angle, from that perspective, we're unlikely to ever get better at whatever the thing is we're doing, because we're unwilling to admit where we might have made errors. And we tend to think that our successes came from right decisions, which encourages us to continue those same decisions, when in fact, it's possible our successes came from luck, and continuing to make those same decisions is actually bad in the future. Yeah. So being really honestly self-reflective is really, really important in all areas of life if you want to continue to get better at what you do. For me, in this case, I think that I've noticed I have a pattern every football season where I tend to play better as the season goes on. And so this year I sort of committed to trying to figure out what that was, like what I was doing differently as the season went on in previous seasons, and start doing it earlier. Right. And what I found for me is earlier in seasons, I have a tendency to be a little too hedgy and to not commit to narrower cores of players in my rosters. So it'd be like, I'd fall into the trap of like, well, this could happen. Well, this could happen. Well, I'll put just a couple percent on this guy, just 1 or 2 rosters of this guy, just in case. That's a terrible way to play, because you're just kind of throwing darts at that point, right, and hoping to get lucky. And I tend to be guilty of that earlier in the season, and then as I see that not work well, I then eventually sort of narrow down, stop doing it. And that's a tendency I've had for a couple of seasons. So I tried very hard to not do that this season, and just to start the season. And one thing I started doing, and I talked about this a couple of times, or at least once with High Low on our Slate show, as I talked about, I try to I come from the corporate world originally, and in the corporate world, one thing that's somewhat popular, even though it's horrid, is a concept called stack ranking. If you're not familiar with stack ranking, what it means is when you're a manager,
I'm not.
So when you're a manager, it means you take your employees and you must rank them in order. So you can't just say Bob did great, Susan did great, Sarah did great, everyone did great. You have to actually say like Bob was first, Susan was second, Sarah was third. It's an exercise that was meant to force you to be very rigorous about, really figuring out who the most valuable employees in your organization are, because managers have a tendency to just sort of be like, everyone did good, it was good. The problem with stack ranking is that it tends to get used for really terrible purposes. Like it originated with General Electric and famous CEO Jack Welch, who then used it famously to cut the bottom. I think it was 5% or 10% of his employees every single year they fired. So it was kind of used in a very cutthroat way. But the principle is interesting as applied to DFS. And so what I would do is I would say, like, I will have, I'm going to rank with my top 6 running backs, my top 10 wide receivers, that kind of thing. And it forced me to be really rigorous about my player pool to say, like, look, a number 7 running back could still be a good play, but he's number 7 and I'm deciding on 6, so he's out.
Yes, I like that.
It forced me to be, and then the problem, of course, is what you do is then you tend to rank them as you rank the really expensible guys first, and then you realize you can't build a roster like that. When your top 10 wide receivers are 10 of the most expensitive wide receivers in the slate, you're like, oh, well, that doesn't work. So you have to think about it from a price considered way. But it's a useful exercise, I think, if you find yourself struggling to narrow down your player pool, I find that to be a useful exercise. So I started doing that this season, found it helpful, and I'll probably continue doing that. I don't know what I'll find when I can look back at my play from this season, but overall, I'm pretty happy with it. Just need to figure out I'm sure there's something to learn from it. I don't know what that is yet.
No, I like that though. I like the ranking thing. That's some good insight on the corporate world as well. Okay,
it's terrible in the corporate world. Absolutely terrible. If you work for an organization that's stack ranking, leave, run as fast as you can.
You heard it here first, folks. Okay, so let's jump into. You ready to jump in and look at this showdown game tonight?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right, cool. So obviously you got the Rams and the Vikings with this, of course, being hosted in Glendale, Arizona. It's not because of the just terrible situation with the fires in LA. You have the Cardinals. That game is going to be played there at Cardinals Stadium. So it's not exactly quite a true home game for the Rams now. I don't know how much that affects it, but as you start to look at this showdown slate, I'm just going to open up a lineup here. I mean, one thing to think of too is just that all the games so far have played to unders. Like we haven't really seen a true shootout so far in these playoffs. And I wonder, is that because it's the playoffs? I don't know. But, in the regular season, we probably look at this and be like, this is going to be a shootout. So how do you kind of how do you look at this game from an overall perspective as we get into kind of getting ready for this build?
Yeah, it is weird, right? I mean, small sample size, right? But 5 games so far, they've all played to the under. And none of them have been particularly close to going over. I mean, one more touchdown could do it in some cases, right? But like just from a mathematical standpoint of how many points, no game went like 1 point under, right? If I'm remembering right. We also only really had one close game, which is disappointing from a DFS perspective as well as from an NFL fan perspective. I think Mike Johnson, one of our content contributors, said something yesterday that like you tend to have more disparities in talent in the wild card round, and that when we get to the divisional round, we should hopefully see more closer, more fun football games to watch. I hope. Yeah. So my thought, like yesterday, was my favorite game of the weekend of the 3 game slate to target and the weekend to target because I felt like it was close spread, high totals, and I knew where the ball was going to go. I feel this way. This game is similar in that it's a close spread, it's a high total, and I feel like with pretty solid, pretty solid accuracy, we can know where the ball's going to go. Both these teams run highly concentrated offenses built around their wide receivers. Minnesota to some extent their tight end. But both these teams run very tight rotations at wide receiver. There's not like a bunch of ancillary guys coming in and out. Both these teams run pretty narrow backfields. I expect, Kyren Williams' role is monstrous. Aaron Jones's role is not as huge, but I expect in the playoffs, you tend to see fewer like RB2, TE3 types on the field in the playoffs. So when you take a team that already has a narrow distribution of volume and then you narrow it further because it's the playoffs, it's possible. Of course, anything is possible, but it's less likely that we have some random like TE3 type from down in the $200 price range put up a good score. Is it possible? Of course it is, right? But injuries happen. trick plays, whatever. But it's more likely that the scores come from the guys who we think they'll come from the starters. And so that is both. It's an interesting dynamic in Showdown, because in Showdown, the pricing structure encourages us to play backups, right? Like you see a lot of backup guys, RB2s, wide receiver 4s, tight end 2s. You see a lot of those guys in Showdown rosters because the pricing structure tends to encourage stars and scrubs builds, and you need to use those cheap plays to make that pricing work. So that creates a really interesting dynamic in this one. And if you remember, one of the things I've said to do that I find useful is before I start building rosters for Showdowns, I will go to an optimizer and just click run, and I'll run some lineups with no settings and see what they pop out. And then I'll go put in some basic correlation stuff. Like I'll say, if I have a wide receiver in the captain spot, I want his quarterback in the lineup. If I have a quarterback in the captain spot, I will not play the opposing defense. Just basic stuff like that. Yep. And then I'll run it and see what I get. And one interesting thing for this Showdown is so stars and scrubs heavy that it keeps putting sub 1K players in there, despite the fact that every sub 1K player on this slate has a reasonable projection of like under 1 fantasy point. So because it wants you to play Justin Jefferson and Puka Nacua and Sam Darnold, who's underpriced for a quarterback of his aptitude, Aaron Jones, whose ceiling is questionable but whose floor is awesome at 8K, right? TJ Hawkinson, who's too cheap. Like there's a lot of players higher in the higher price range who optimizers want to shove into your rosters. And that means that from a projection standpoint, the highest projected rosters are basically taking a 0 somewhere, which is wild.
Yeah.
And it's very rare. It's happened, but it's very, very rare to actually see a roster like that win. It has happened. I've seen winning rosters with 0s, but it's very, very rare. And so because that's what optimizers want, I think that creates an edge for us on this Showdown slate, because a lot of people just play with what the optimizers want. So for me, because it's the playoffs, because I think it's less likely guys like Trent Sherfield and Davis Allen and Hunter Long and whatever are going to be on the field very much, that creates an opportunity to me to build rosters that I think are like, let me back up. I think there'll be more rosters that are just probably dead at lock because they're rostering guys like Brandon Powell and Trent Sherfield who are near locks for a 0. Now, does that mean like someone could get hurt? Those guys can come on the field as a result. They can catch a pass or two. It could happen, right? So, but all we can do is try to play the odds. I think the odds are that those guys are dead roster spots, and that there'll be a fair number of rosters in this tournament that are just dead because they're playing with a dead roster spot. So
now, to ask a quick follow-up question. So, like, do you think that a lot of players, or at least enough to make an impact, are just saying, is this a 150 lineup player that you're thinking is saying, okay, I'm not going to be able to control like all 150, have quality control, so I'm just going to accept like a certain number of who did you say? Hunter Long, whoever, just I'm fine with those guys being in, or is it just more the average player who's like, this is the breaks, I got to just play these and hope it works, I mean,
I think to some extent both, right? Like I think what people see is they see the optimizer says this is the highest projected lineup, and it says to play CJ Ham or Johnny Munt or Hunter Long, and so I guess I'll go with that. And if you decide to run 150, it's gonna like CJ Lamb is a 0 more often than not. If you decide to, he's a fullback, right? If you decide to play with an optimizer, those are the guys it's going to try to put in, because remember, an optimizer's job is to come up with the highest projected point lineup within the set of constraints that we give it as users, right? And the highest projected lineup is going to have, because there's a disparity at the very top between Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson, Sam Darnold, and there's a gap between everyone else. If you look at point projections around the industry, then Aaron Jones projects very, very well for his salary, high median at his salary. And then you've got TJ Hawkinson, who's just kind of too cheap. It's like most lineups want those 5 guys or 4 of those 5 guys. And if you play those guys, you just run out of salary real quick. Yeah. And so that ends up kind of forcing you to put like a cheap play in. And projections say that even if you take the 0 from the cheap play, that lineup still outprojects a lineup that doesn't use a $200 guy because you have to give up one of these 4 or 5 really, really valuable guys. Now, it's not like every lineup's going to be that structure, right?
But enough to matter. Yeah, like you're saying.
Enough to matter, right? Enough to matter. I think we're going to see higher than normal ownership on the sub 1K punts, and they're not going to be 20% owned, right? CJ Ham is not going to be 20% owned,
right?
But I would guess guys like CJ Ham, Trent Sherfield, those guys, where normally they're sub 1%, right? They're like 0.2, 0.4. They're probably going to be like 1 to 2, 3% owned, and then you realize there's like 7 of them, and that's
right.
You could get like
cumulative ownership. Then
you could get
guys.
like you could easily get like 10% of rosters being basically dead because they're playing a sub 1K guy.
Yeah, man.
And then the other thing to keep in mind is like the reason why I'm wary of playing into that strategy is because that also means that lineups that play one of those guys are going to be heavily duplicated.
Yes.
Because even though those guys themselves are still likely to be low owned, the structure of what you can do with them in the lineup, there's only so many lineups you can build with those guys, and so those lineups will be popular.
Yes, man. Yes, exactly. So you have that double edge. Not only do you have 10% of lineups with just a cheap guy that's probably dead, but then it's like if you get away from that strategy, you're more likely to be unique as a result, which makes me excited for this. I'm ready to jump. I mean, where do we start, dude?
Well, there's one other dynamic that's important to touch here, which is a player dynamic, an individual player, and that player is Cooper Kupp. So Cooper Kupp has sort of fallen off a bit lately, right? Like Cooper Kupp has 3 games in a row of under 10 fantasy points. And if you kind of go back, like he's missed games through injury again this season, but he also has a couple games over 30 and he has several games of 20 plus. He's 9,400. That's like objectively too expensive for what he's done lately, for what his role in the offense has been lately. And we talked about him on the Saturday show as being a really good tournament play on the 6-game slate because the pricing dynamic was different there. Like on the 6-game slate, he was priced close to guys like, say, Jordan Addison. I think he was like 300 more than Jordan Addison on the 6-game slate. In Showdown, he's 2,400 more than Jordan Addison. So the gap is much different, right? And this is one of the things, if you play multiple types of contests, you can take advantage of where the pricing does different things from contest to contest. So Cooper Kupp was a really smart guy to get exposure to on the 6-game slate. But that said, like we still have a guy who's 9,400 who's shown multiple times this season he has a 30-point ceiling. So he's a really interesting decision point. He's objectively too expensive for his median, but we don't play for mean or median, right? Like if a player scores their mean or median, we probably lost anyway, so who cares, right? If Puka Nacua scores his mean, that's probably not doing enough for us, so who cares? We play for ceilings. I think that because of his price and because of where most sites around the industry have him projected for points, that's going to keep his ownership in a really like favorable position because like it's hard to click on Cooper Kupp right now when you've got Sam Darnold priced $200 away from him. You've got Aaron Jones priced cheaper than him, who's projecting about the same or even better. You've got Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua projecting really well. Like, and the point projections I'm looking at, so I aggregate point projections from multiple sources, and I aggregate them together. So when I look at my point projections, I have Cooper Kupp projected for about 13.6 points. He is the 8th highest projected point player on the slate, but he is the 5th highest salary on the slate. And so that's going to keep his ownership down. So he's a really interesting tournament play. And he's risky, right? He's very, very risky. And I will, full disclosure, I'm not going to put him in the lineup I'm building right now because I think I'm just going to go a different direction. But I think Cooper Kupp is a very, very interesting play this week. It's also worth noting the way Cooper Kupp plays lines up well with helping the Rams offset what the Vikings do. So the Vikings play a ton of too high and they blitz a lot, right? So they're trying to take away deep passes, and they're trying to bring a ton of pressure on the quarterback. So Cooper Kupp as a slot receiver, as a high catch percentage, right, relatively lower ADOT receiver compared to Puka Nacua, like that tends to play into Cooper Kupp's strengths. Does that mean he's going to have a good game? Not necessarily, right? But I think it's a decent chance his targets could be on the high end of his range because they could try to use him with like sort of ball out quick, trying to counteract the Vikings pass rush. And so what he does well aligns well with what teams need to do against Minnesota to succeed. So I think he's a really interesting tournament play. Again, I'm full disclosure, spoiler alert, I'm not going to put him in the tournament, but I think he's a really, really interesting tournament play, and I think he's a very clear like spot to overweight the field. And I'm almost glad that he's a little too expensive because I think that will keep people off of him.
Absolutely.
As compared to say, like, I'm just looking at FanDuel's prices. Like on FanDuel, Cooper Kupp is $11K, and on FanDuel pricing, that puts him. He's priced in between Jordan Addison and Aaron Jones, and that's probably about where he should be. And so on FanDuel, he's going to be. I think he's going to be much more popular because the pricing gap between Kupp and the premium receivers like Puka and Jefferson is much more significant. On FanDuel, he's way cheaper than Sam Darnold. He's cheaper than Matthew Stafford. He's cheaper than Aaron Jones. Right on DraftKings, he's more expensive than all those guys. Actually, Darnold's $200 more than him on DraftKings. But on FanDuel, Darnold is $3,000 more. So the pricing tier separates it, right? And so Cooper Kupp is going to be more owned on FanDuel.
Yes.
Doesn't mean he's a bad play, but the ownership's likely to be higher. On DraftKings is where if you're playing on multiple sites, one thing I like to do, or if I play multiple sites, is look to take advantage of the pricing discrepancies between the sites. And so, like, if playing multiple sites tonight, I'd be more interested in playing Cooper Kupp on DraftKings than on FanDuel, where the pricing makes him more challenging to fit into a lineup on DraftKings.
Yes. No,
anyway,
absolutely, dude. No, I like that discussion a lot.
There's my Cooper Kupp spiel. Let's get into this lineup. So, again, if we back up and you remember what I said about how there are, all these like really, really cheap value plays that the optimizers are going to try to shove in, like for me, the immediate decision there is to say, well, I just won't play any of those really cheap value plays. And so if you go start looking at the value plays and figure out like, where can I find guys who are going to be on the field with a real role, who aren't likely to have their role evaporate because it's the playoffs and teams like concentrate a lot. So like, let's go look a couple cheap guys down there. Like for example, Tutu Atwell and Jordan Whittington. Those are two guys who in a normal showdown, there's a good chance they'd be on the field a little bit. You can see, and they might catch a couple of passes. And you hope that lands. You hope that gets into the end zone. But it's like, look at Tutu Atwell, for example. Like go look at his game logs, if you would, please. So last game he had 8 targets because Puka and Kupp didn't play in week 18. But 0 targets, but then 2 targets, 3 targets, right? Normal week we expect like Tutu Atwell to play 30-40% of the snaps, get 1 or 2 targets. In showdown, that makes him a viable target. In the playoffs, it's possible that Tutu Atwell just doesn't play because they say, hey, it's the playoffs, we're going to play our main guys every snap. Will that happen? I don't know for sure, right? But that's at least possible. So it makes these cheap value plays a lot more fragile. The guys who are if you look at the guys priced say below the defenses, there's only a couple guys who I am entirely confident will be on the field, like they will play. There's 3 of them. They are Jalen Nailor, Tyler Higbee, and Josh Oliver. So Jalen Nailor is the wide receiver 3 for the Vikings. Like he's going to play no matter what. Tyler Higbee is the tight end 1 for the Rams. He's back. He spent most of the season recovering from, I think it was an ACL injury he had at the end of last year. I think most of the recovering from, he's finally made his way back. And Josh Oliver is in this sort of weird tight end split with TJ Hawkinson that I do not honestly understand why they're not just playing TJ Hawkinson. But they have insisted on playing Josh Oliver all year. They like him. Does that go away in the playoffs? It could, but like because they've insisted on playing Josh Oliver over TJ Hawkinson in some spots, I think he probably still sees the field. And then Tutu Atwell has a pretty good chance of seeing the field for at least a little bit. All the other guys down here are just like, they might not play at all. So Naylor is probably the highest ceiling guy because he is a wide receiver who he sometimes runs deeper routes, right? He has his average yards per catch is 14.8. So he gets deep targets. Yep. So he's the kind of guy who can hit unlimited volume. He is a good cheap play. Tyler Higbee is, to me, a very interesting cheap play here, because if you go look at Tyler Higbee's snap counts, right? Like, so let me go get the actual numbers. I didn't have them up. I'm sorry. I fail.
I'll just
1 sec. Los Angeles Rams. So he's been back for 3 games. He's played 27%, 30%, and 41% of the snaps in those 3 games. The Rams have no other tight end worth mentioning who's like in front of him blocking him, right? They don't want to play Hunter Long or Davis Allen or Colby Parkinson over Tyler Higbee. Tyler Higbee used to play, before he got hurt, he was playing like 90% plus of the snaps. If you look at his targets, 7 targets last week. Now, again, the Rams arrested most of their starters, so it makes sense. He's one of the better players on the field for them. But like, I think that Tyler Higbee's, it's reasonable to expect his snap count to continue to increase. It's reasonable to think that he's going to do a decent job earning targets while on the field, because they basically only have Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, Kyron Williams, and then Demarcus Robinson. It's like, and Demarcus Robinson is not a heavy target earner, and Kyron Williams is not a heavy target earner for running back. So it's reasonable to think that he's going to get a decent market share of targets. I think Tyler Higbee is an awesome play in this showdown, especially since like we're sort of starved for value, and I probably end up on a lot of him and a lot of Naylor as well. And I probably would try to avoid going below those guys, maybe a little bit of Oliver, but other than that, I'm going to try to avoid going below that tier of value.
Yeah.
So now that's our sort of framework for how we're thinking about this roster. And so if we know that we're not going to play Tyler Higbee, if we know we're going to play someone like Tyler Higbee or Jalen Naylor and not one of those $200 guys, it makes it a little harder to put to roster, say, a Justin Jefferson or a Puka Nacua in the captain spot. Doable. It is doable. You can still do it, right? Without going down to the super punt plays. But in this roster, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play Jordan Addison at captain. And so I think, the 2 highest owned captains by a fairly wide margin in this showdown are going to be Justin Jefferson and Puka Nacua.
Yep.
And they should be. They're both great players. My point, though, is be careful how you build rosters around those 2 when you have them on the same roster and one of them is the captain. Like, if you have Justin Jefferson and Puka Nacua on the same roster and one of those 2 is the captain, just recognize that you're starting from a spot that a lot of people are going to start from. And that's okay, right? That's absolutely okay. It does mean that you're going to have to figure out how to differentiate your roster somewhere else, because so many rosters are going to start with that build. And on teams that have a narrower distribution of targets, on teams that have fewer guys they use, it's a little harder to differentiate, because you can't differentiate by finding that 1% owned guy, or you can, right? But it's harder when those guys might not see the field.
Yeah.
So we're going to go a different way and say, okay, instead of Justin Jefferson, we're going to play Jordan Addison. Another way you can do this is say, instead of Puka Nacua, we're going to play Cooper Kupp, right? It's like, just flip the build and say, instead of the wide receiver 1, I'm playing the wide receiver 2. Because the wide receiver 2 outscores the wide receiver 1 a fair percentage of the time. Jordan Addison has shown a big ceiling. He's shown a 30+ point ceiling on a couple of occasions this season, right? Will he? I don't know, right? But like, I think that he is a really interesting high ceiling captain choice who frees up salary for us and also just gets us off of the Jefferson Puka pairings that are going to be so common. So now we want Puka, because like I said, I probably want one of Jefferson or Puka in every build. And you can play the wide receiver 1 and 2 together, of course. So just because you have Addison doesn't mean you can't play Jefferson. Just because you have Puka doesn't mean you can't play Kupp. But those 2 guys are the centerpieces of their offense, and I probably want to have at least one in every build I make.
Yeah.
They're so darn good.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
The next obvious spot to put in is Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold is a little bit underpriced for what he's actually done this season. The matchup is fine. We know we have a Minnesota Vikings wide receiver in the captain spot, so it makes sense to, I don't use a rule to force a quarterback with a pass catcher captain, but I do, like, in my optimizer, I boost them. So what I say is, like, if Jordan Addison or Justin Jefferson or TJ Hawkinson are the captain of this roster, boost Sam Darnold's projection by 10%. So it makes it more likely that Sam Darnold would appear in that roster, right? We know there's a positive correlation there. You don't always have to force it, but I will say, though, that because Sam Darnold projects really well, one other way to consider getting different in your Justin Jefferson captain rosters is not to play Sam Darnold in them, right?
Yeah.
That's another way. That's another way to consider being different in this one. So
And
now
in
we
that,
have. Oh, sorry.
yeah, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, in that case, like, would you play Jefferson but not play an additional Vikings pass catcher, maybe like Aaron Jones or something like that, if you wanted Jefferson without Darnold?
Yeah, you could. I mean, what you're hoping for is that like Jefferson gets there more on yards than touchdowns.
Yeah,
So, like if Jefferson gets 150 yards or 120 yards on 10 catches, but only gets one touchdown, that might not generate a ceiling for Sam Darnold,
exactly.
right? And you're also then hoping that like other expensive guys outperform him. But you probably don't want like Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison without Sam Darnold, because then it's like, well, how do they both generate a ceiling and Sam Darnold scores 10 points? Like that's possible, but it's like you need Justin Jefferson throwing a touchdown to Jordan Addison or something like that,
Yeah,
which can happen, right?
never know.
Trick plays. Okay, so we got kind of the core of our lineup, and now we know we are sort of running. We're starting. I don't want to say running low on salary because we have a lot still, but given that we don't want to go for like a really cheap play, we're starting to run low on salary, right? So we don't want to have like a $200 player or something. We do have enough though to put in one Matt Stafford, and so now we have the buildings of a shootout lineup, right? Two pass catchers, two quarterbacks from each team so far, and so this is looking like a shootout lineup, right? This is looking like a lineup that's predicated on a lot of passing, a lot of success in the air for both teams, kind of a back and forth affair. We know again both offenses are highly concentrated in the passing game. The Vikings face the second highest opposing passing percentage, I believe. The Rams are a little more attackable in different ways, but the Vikings like to pass themselves. So through the air seems like, to me, the most likely path for production in this game.
Yes.
You're not getting cute by being different by the Vikings ground game anyway, because Aaron Jones is priced at a point where he's going to be really, really owned. So, I think this is probably my preferred way to approach this slate is the aerial game. So now we have 2 slots left. We have 10K, so we have some cash. We can't get like to a stud. Like we can't get to Cooper Kupp in this lineup unless we wanted to totally punt, which
Right.
I don't. But we do have, we can't get to Justin Jefferson at all. But there is a guy who is very, very underpriced for his role, I think, or for his ceiling, which is TJ Hawkinson. I mentioned a couple times he is underpriced.
Oh, yeah.
We haven't really seen the Hawkinson ceiling game. He had a 20-point game fairly soon after coming back, but we haven't really seen the ceiling game from him yet. Excuse me. But he does have games of 6, 7, 8 targets at 5,600. Like that will do nicely. The Rams are not an imposing pass defense in any way, shape, or form. And you're also kind of saying like Justin Jefferson is this big sort of void in the offense, right? He absorbs a lot of volume most of the time. And so what you're saying by not playing him is, well, that production has to go somewhere else, right?
Exactly.
And it's possible, but unlikely that it's going to flow to Jordan Addison in a way that, like, Jordan Addison is going to have a hard time taking enough market share of targets to make Justin Jefferson underperform all by himself.
Exactly.
Like, so you need to think about like, okay, so if Justin Jefferson underperforms, how does that happen? Either he doesn't get any targets or he doesn't catch many targets. Well, he's a really darn good player in a good matchup, so not catching many of his targets is possible, but unlikely. What probably happens is just the nature of the way the game plays out, the way the coverage is, it just sort of results in Jefferson getting, 6, 7, 8 targets and not 12 targets. And then that's how he ends up not winning, not in the optimal. So if he gets 6, 7, or 8 targets instead of 12 targets, what does that mean? Well, it could mean the Vikings control the game and pass less, but we're already building for a high scoring affair, so that's not part of our build. So we're building for a high scoring affair with a lot of pass attempts, but Justin Jefferson not hitting. You almost need 2 Vikings pass catchers in that scenario. You basically need to say Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson both go over their regular market share of targets, and that's how Jefferson goes under by a meaningful amount, right?
Yep.
So we'll plop in Hawk, and now we're down to
Right.
4,700. So we have some choices, right? We could play a defense, and so you could turn this into like you could viably play the Vikings defense here. I think the Vikings defense is very good, very aggressive. Right? We played them in DFS a lot this year. I don't love having quarterback and defense opposing each other because like it's hard for Matthew Stafford to find a ceiling if he's throwing picks and getting sacked a bunch. He's not a running quarterback, so I don't love the Vikings defense here, but it's viable.
Yeah.
Or you could play one of the cheap guys we mentioned. So Jalen Naylor would fit in this build. And Higby would fit in this build. because we're building for a back, like we talked about this lineup looks like a back and forth passing affair. I think going 3-3 with 3 Rams, 3 Vikings is the structure that makes the most sense. So we're going to put in Tyler Higbee. He will finish our lineup.
Love it.
So I also think this lineup achieves, like in a slate like this, it's a little harder than normal to achieve differentiation, because the narrower the team, where they don't spread the ball out as much, it takes away one angle of finding differentiation, because ownership gets more concentrated on the guys who are likely to be on the field. The guys who are likely to be on the field are in fact very likely to be on the field. It's harder for guys like these cheaper 1%, 2% owned guys to find enough playing time to find a ceiling that lets them be in optimal lineups. So ownership tends to get very concentrated in these types of slates, and it makes it hard to differentiate, harder than normal. So we have to be thoughtful about how we do it. And so this lineup achieves a couple different points of differentiation. One, by swapping out Justin Jefferson for Jordan Addison, who, especially at the captain spot, I think Addison's going to be much lower owned than Jefferson at captain. Like Addison's probably 5-6% at captain. Jefferson's probably pushing 20.
And that's big.
And then we're also leaving $1,700 in salary on the table on a slate where, again, when you have a lot of really expensive players that people want to play, leaving salary on the table is especially uncomfortable. And so I think that's another good way to differentiate on a slate like this. Is leaving salary on the table is always a viable way to differentiate, but especially on a slate where pricing is tight because we want to play a bunch of expensive guys, it's harder to leave salary on the table in slates like that. So
exactly, absolutely love it, Xandamere. So the final lineup that we settled on, Jordan Addison in the captain with Puka Nacua, Sam Darnold, Matthew Stafford, TJ Hawkinson, and Tyler Higbee. And yeah, man, like you said, trying to get different, trying to find ways to differentiate, because hopefully if you are winning first tonight, you're not sharing it with 150 other lineups or something like that. So Xandamere, is always great stuff, man. Again, this show has been incredible this entire season. I'm excited. I'm definitely going to be putting some lineups in tonight, trying to play. So hopefully one of us, man, can find our way to the tops of the leaderboard. But as always, appreciate the time.
Yeah, it's fun. I will look forward to seeing you again next year. The show has been super fun. I hope it's been useful to folks out there in the audience. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hanging out with us. Good luck tonight, man. If you play, I wish you luck. I hope someone takes it down. One of us.
Thank you, man. Yes, I will. I'll take all the luck I can get. Yeah, I've really enjoyed the show. I'm playing more Showdown as a result of just being able to learn on this show. Hopefully you guys who are listening have as well. Remember, head to oneweekseason.com. Check out, there's a lot more than just this over there. So all that to say, Xandamere, we'll catch you, I guess at this point, probably catch you next season, but I'm looking forward to it already. And what I'll be talking to you as we get into the off season.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me.